Okay, can folks hear me? So, my name is Laura Friedman. I am with the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Very, very happy to have you all here today, and thanks to MEI, this fabulous building we are in to make this possible. So, the Foundation for Middle East Peace is a Washington-based U.S. endowment, a C3, and one of the main things we do is support the great work of organizations on the ground who are working to challenge the occupation and to fight for a progressive future for Israelis and Palestinians and all that good stuff. We are privileged today to have representatives of 3 of our grantees working on the ground doing amazing work. So I am not going to waste your time making you listen to me. I want to hear from them, and I want to hear from them as much as I think you do. So I think you've all seen the invitations. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the bios. Far left, and that's not a political comment, it's just a directional comment, is Sharon Abraham Weiss of ACRI, which is the equivalent of the ACLU in Israel. In the middle is Suhad Baba from, most of us know her in her role as the head of Just Vision here in the States. Just Vision has a project in Israel, which is called, in English, Local Call, in Hebrew, yeah, I'm going to let them pronounce it, my Hebrew is not that good. So she's going to talk about that work. And then immediately to my left, again, just directionally, is Hagai Matar from 972. 972 is the online blog magazine, which in many ways has revolutionized the discourse around the occupation, particularly by putting in English some of the best analysis and the most original and courageous reporting out there. So what we're going to do, we're going to start on the left and move right with Sharon, and each of our speakers will speak for 5 to 10 minutes, and then I will engage them in a short conversation, unless people in the audience are so determined to ask questions they interrupt me. Otherwise, we'll have a brief conversation up here, and then we'll open it up to questions. And I will lay down my rules about questions when the time comes. So I'm going to hand it over to Sharon.
Hello, thank you for coming. Good afternoon. So I'll just say a couple of words about ACRI before beginning to freedom of press. So ACRI, the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, was established in 1972, following the model of the ACLU. We are dealing with civil and political rights, socio-economic rights. We are a minority in Israel, immigration, refugees, and the rights of the Palestinians in the occupied territories. Mainly legal organization. I don't know how much you're familiar with the legal system in Israel, but we have a possibility to go directly to the High Court of Justice in petitions that has to be principal matters, so we don't need to wait an appeal, we can go directly, and this is a tool that we are using very much. We also have an education department and a public in our context of freedom of press, which is obviously part of the freedom of expression. So in the state of Israel, in the 1948 borders, it's recognized right since 1952. The first verdict that related to the freedom of press was given then, Kol Ha'am, and it's telling about how important is the right, and it's, I guess, very similar to what you know here in the US about freedom of expression and how it's an important pillar in a democratic country. I would think that most of the years that I am practicing, which is like 15 years, I felt that we in Israel take it for granted in many ways, the freedom of speech. And I felt that it's quite, the arena and the press was quite obvious, clear, you could express yourself, there was a vibrant civil society and it was possible to speak about it. Having said that, in the past couple of years, we we are experiencing what we call shrinking democratic space in many ways, with restrictions on democracy, meaning not only the rule of majority, but also the rights of the minorities. And I want to relate mainly a recent case that we have pending in Supreme Court since July. So in 17 July or 18, in the old city of Jerusalem, two soldiers were killed by a Palestinian. And as a result, the Israeli government decided to block the entrances to some parts of the old city and put machines. Obviously, this is something very interesting to the press, to the public. When lives were taken, and a couple of days later, 3 Palestinians were killed there. And the press was very much interested in this. And we heard from journalists that were about to come into the old city that they were not allowed. On the entrances to the old city, they were asked, "Are you a journalist?" And it's very easy to identify because of the cameras and they don't want to say, "Yes, I'm a journalist," they were not allowed. Now, you would say, wow, security reasons, this is something very heavy. But on the other hand, as one of the affidavits we were given by one of the journalists, other people were allowed inside. So journalists out, other people in. So that's, it drops the security reasons. We tried to figure out what's the policy, what's going on. And more journalists were standing up and saying, they don't want us there. They don't want to cover. They don't want us to cover, and this severe violation of freedom of press. And then it was said by the police that the reason they don't want journalists is that the journalists are the cause of the provocation for the riots. So if we prevent journalists to get in, we wouldn't have any violence and riots. So we get in this vicious circle. Let's keep the journalists out of the frame, and everything will be fine. So we obviously, took it to the Supreme Court together with other organizations, and it's still pending. The government did not give a good answer yet. 2 weeks ago, the legal advisor for the police repeats their stand from July, saying the journalists are to blame, and this is something we're very worried about. Very worried about, definitely, as I'm going back to the question of what is a democracy, and the sunlight and transparency, and I guess that's what we're talking about today.
So first of all, Laura and Phil and Ahmed, thank you for hosting this, as well as the folks in the room who I know are involved with New Israel Fund as co-hosts for this afternoon. I wanted to really kind of piggyback off of Sharon's presentation, which I think really sets up the context for the environment that Just Vision works in and what we're responding to as an organization. For those of you who are less familiar with Just Vision's work, we are a team of Palestinian, Israeli, and American journalists, filmmakers, storytellers, and human rights advocates who create compelling multimedia coupled with public engagement campaigns in the US, in Israel, and in Palestine to highlight Palestinian and Israeli grassroots leaders who are working to end the occupation and the conflicts. At the heart of our work, we've placed storytelling and transformative media as part of our mission. Because of the fact that so often on this issue, in addition to the big political environment and policies that Sharon alluded to in this conversation, we're also looking at a sort of secondary issue around the way that the mainstream media actually tells the stories coming out of Israel and Palestine, who they're highlighting, and what the context is that they're presenting. I think for most of us in this room, we would agree that there is no lack of coverage of what's happening in Israel, Palestine, and the Middle East more broadly. But the question for us is, what are the stories being told and who is being highlighted? Oftentimes we'll see stories about violence, about militarism,
about failed top-down political developments that for the outside world makes it seem as though this issue is completely intractable and that there's nothing to do about it. And yet, we know that there are courageous community organizers and human rights defenders and journalists, two of whom are here with us today, that are at the front lines of this struggle and are often either being made invisible or being criminalized for their behavior in order to justify their repression. And so Just Vision is really a response to that. We've done this work for over 14 years through a number of different forms. Some of you may be familiar with films like our last feature-length documentary, Budrus, which have been hand-delivered to folks like the President of the United States to both put nonviolent resistance on the map and to more importantly show what nonviolent resistance can achieve when we pay attention to them. Films like My Neighborhood, which looks at settlement expansion across East Jerusalem, that we partner with mainstream media organizations like The Guardian to reach millions around the world to ensure that populations around the globe understand what the impact of settlement expansion, which we so often hear in abstract policy terms, actually looks like for communities in the region and what those communities are doing to challenge the status quo. And a few years ago, we began to look and explore different strategies for storytelling that led us to ultimately launch, together with 972 Magazine, Sichana Gomit. It's a Hebrew language news site that highlights the stories of human and civil rights issues taking place across the region that impact a number of communities that are often marginalized. So certainly Palestinians living within the occupied territories, Palestinians living within Israel that constitute a 20% minority but are often treated as second-class citizens, African asylum seekers, LGBTQ activists, and so on. And I want to pause there and share a little bit. I know the guy is going to dive into a little bit deeper around what it looks like from a journalist perspective, writing on this issue. But I want to pause and share a little bit about why we decided to launch Sichana Gomit, because I think it illuminates the challenges that teams like ours are operating in when we're looking at the context of Israel and Palestine.
What's it called?
Sichana Gomit. In English, it's local call. And it's a double entendre, but it's the phone call that you make locally. So as a little bit of background, our team was founded in 2003. And for the first decade of our work or so, our primary means of operating was creating compelling documentary films that were tied to public engagement campaigns that we would run in American, Israeli, and Palestinian society. And our strategy was two prongs. On one hand, we want to ultimately shift the social norms on this issue, shift the narrative so that people who are organizing on the ground are more visible, and so that audiences understand the inequalities that are taking place, that they're challenging. We also are working on a deep community by community level, working to reach those audiences that already have stake in this issue. So, for example, in the United States, your faith communities or those who are ethnically identified with Israel and Palestine, as well as those communities that have the power to organize and mobilize students, educators, the vast ecosystem of organizations and constituencies that are working on this issue. In our work internationally, we were having some good success on both of those fronts. We were able to successfully reach the press, BBC, the New York Times, CNN, and so on, policymakers and thought leaders. And we were able to also reach those communities that are so deeply involved in this. In Israeli society, we were running into some challenges. And a few years ago, we decided to hit the pause button. What we were seeing was that on an individual level, on a community-based level, there were some really transformative experiences that we were having. We would film and screen stories like Budrus for young Israeli students, for example, who were getting ready to go into the military, who would see a film like Budrus and say, knowing what I know now about what's happening in the occupied territories, I have to rethink my military service. Or knowing what I know now, I want to join the protests in Sheikh Jarrah. And that, to me, is an incredible transformation. Yet, at the same time, what we were seeing was the consolidation of the extreme right wing in the highest levels of power in Israel. And folks who were getting activated to mobilize on this issue were looking for outlets to be able to engage. Meanwhile, the activists that we were working with were saying, look, the space in Israeli society to organize is shrinking. We're under attack by the government. We don't have a place to organize, and our platform, our voice, is slowly failing seeming to disappear. And so at that point, it's 2013, and my colleague Yael Meron, who's our public engagement manager in Israel, sits down with a number of editors, journalists, and activists to understand what are the needs at that time in Israeli society. How do we actually reach the mainstream media? And she's told time and again by various editors, look, either the stories of human and civil rights that you want to tell, there's no interest in the Israeli public. When they were, and some of them even said, look, that these stories are not politically viable. They would never make it past the editorial desk. She came back and said, look, our best option right now is to launch our own platform. At that point, I've been working with a guy, we've been working together for a number of years. 972 magazine in English was flourishing. And we said, wait a second, why don't we join forces, combine our expertise and skills and strategies, and build something that not only could become a home for the activists and voices of dissent across the region, but also have the strength to disrupt the Israeli mainstream media conversation and force them to respond to our coverage. It's been about 3.5 years. The site has grown to 2.5 million unique readers. And some of the very same mainstream media players who said, look, your stories don't hold water in the Israeli public are now turning to us and saying, let's partner, let's follow up on this story. And so what we've seen with Comic Meet is that while the environment is incredible, there's a number of challenges in Israeli society, and it's increasingly feeling as though the space is shrinking. There are also opportunities to get around that, to push the edges, and that there is a hunger and a thirst for these kinds of stories that can ultimately transform what's happening on the ground. I want to turn this over to Hagai, though, to really dive into what that looks like.
Thank you. So I think what I'm going to say is going to relate slightly to what both Sharon and Suhad were saying. First is the angle of the attacks on media. What does that look like right now as a journalist? How do we experience these attacks? The other thing is, as a journalist working in alternative media, how do we see mainstream media and its downside? On the one hand, we have these attacks on media. Sharon described beautifully the recent development with police that has decided to push journalists away from areas of confrontation, of demonstrations, as a tool to limit the demonstrations themselves and limit coverage. So that is a very big thing that we've been doing. ACRI has done great work on this. And also, but this is just one part of a wider puzzle of attacks by the government that we've seen rising in recent years against the media. This includes, and I'm going to give a short list of examples, but they're important, I think. First of all media outlets are bound by law to file stories with the military censorship before publication. This has been like that since Israel was founded. What we've been seeing in the past few years is a rise in the military censorship's intervention with other publications, such as Facebook. So we have seen a rise of 100% in the past 2 years of the military censorship's intervention with Facebook pages, turning to Facebook pages and saying, you are now being watched and you have to file stories with us, or the story you published has to go down, and so on, by Israelis, of course. So another tool that we see the government using is the tool of gag orders issued by the court at the request of either the police, the army, or the Secret Service, Shabak. Over the past 15 years, the number of these gag orders has tripled, and for the past 3 years, they grow constantly by 20% a year. This is a research that was recently published in mapping out the massive rise in the use of gag orders. Another thing that we've been seeing is the attempts by government to use regulation, to use manipulation of capitalist-owned media outlets by promising the owners of the media better regulation or better laws for their other businesses in exchange for positive coverage. And this has been done almost out in the open, not completely, but it's It's almost out in the open. And we've seen coverage change. We've seen media outlets change their coverage of specifically the Netanyahu family. It's not like generally the right, it's specifically the Netanyahu family in exchange for financial benefits that the government can offer them. Another thing that we've been seeing, and some of you might recognize this from things that have been happening here, is the ongoing incitement by specifically the Prime Minister Netanyahu against journalists, kind of singling out either specific journalists or specific media outlets and saying they are part of the enemy. And we're talking about mainstream media, not like radicals and alternative media such as Local Call and 972 Magazine. We're talking about the mainstream media is being targeted because it's not loyal enough, it's not patriotic enough, and therefore it is being accused of being allied with the NIF, allied with the radical left, allied with BDS, and so on and so on, and trying to delegitimize the work of honest journalists in mainstream media by calling them out as liars and traitors and so on. I think it's important to pause here and notice that this is something that's happening globally, as I mentioned. You know it here. These things are happening elsewhere. They're happening in Russia. They're happening in Eastern Europe. They're happening in many different places. And the people that are doing this understand and see their play, I think, as an international play. They recognize, we know that, for example, Breitbart News was created and founded in Jerusalem, in fact. I don't know how many people know this, that the initial idea to set up Breitbart News came up in Jerusalem, with Andrew Breitbart saying, okay, we needed a media outlet to protect Israel from J Street and the leftist media, and that kind of grew from there. Sheldon Adelson, supporter of Republican candidates here in the US, is also the publisher of the most widely read newspaper in Israel that's extremely supportive of, again, the Netanyahu family. So these moves are being done internationally in a coordinated way. At the same time that all these things are happening, I think we should also pay attention to the problems of mainstream media in Israel itself. And I think here, mainstream media in Israel differs from some of the media outlets that we know here, in that it is not an ally of progressive forces. It is not an ally of anyone that aspires for a more egalitarian, just, peaceful society without occupation. It does not do that. Mainstream media would often be supportive and accepting almost automatically of the official narratives by the IDF's or police spokesperson. And a perfect example, and I'll try and close with this, of how these two trends meet is the story of Hiran. It's a Bedouin village in the south of Israel, unrecognized village, which means that it's been there for many, many years, but the government is refusing to recognize it. It's legal. Just recently, the government decided to destroy the village and set up a Jewish settlement instead of it. These are Israeli citizens. This is not in the architecture, of course. And one day in January, a mass force, police force, came early in the morning, 5 in the morning, to the village to start demolishing houses. What happened there was that one of the residents of the village was about to leave the village in his car. Police opened fire on his car, killing the citizen. The car then lost control, hit a policeman, and the policeman was killed. Journalists were blocked from reaching Hiran. Journalists were not allowed to come in. The police barricaded, put a siege around the village, and journalists that heard that people were being killed there were not able to come in and verify what was happening. Local Call and 972 Magazine were the only media outlets to actually have people in there from the night before, because we knew there were going to be evictions, and we thought that the story is worth telling even without bloodshed, even without anyone being killed. Just the eviction is worthwhile. So we were actually there, and we were able to give testimony and have pictures, videos of what was happening. However, most media outlets, and this is the media's fault, just automatically accepted the initial police statements about an ISIS terrorist that committed a ramming attack and killed a policeman, and therefore police were forced to shoot in self-defense, and therefore the ISIS terrorist was killed. Almost all Israeli media outlets published this story, even without quotations. It wasn't even like police says that. It's like a ramming attack, killing, and so on and so on. Only after we reported from the information we had from the ground were we able to change the narrative, and we saw all media outlets retracting their initial statements. So this is kind of where I'm trying to identify the potential of alternative media, independent media, in challenging both the limitations of government and the downsides of mainstream media in Israel.
Great. So let me just a couple of follow-ups, and starting with Sharon. I want you to talk a little bit more about the shrinking democratic space question and how that is or is not manifesting. I mean, we've seen this in the West Bank for years. We've seen this with the last Gaza war, when journalists basically had to perch themselves on a hill and try to see what was going on from outside Gaza. Now in East Jerusalem, now you just referenced in the negative. Many of us have talked about sort of the creeping occupation policies as they creep into mainstream Israel, inside the Green Line. Can you talk about that a little bit more? Is it happening rapidly, or are these just one-offs when there's a specific thing? Talking a little about what trends maybe you see and are worried about.
So as was said here before, it's not only about Israel, and we see it in many Western countries. We see it in a couple of things. One is the civil society in general, criticizing the civil society or anybody that is trying to argue, to put a question mark, to challenge the main policy. Civil society is one of them. Journalism is another. I mean, clearly, what I would think most mainstream Israeli journalists has been under a real attack this year when they're covering criticism on the government, and also Supreme Court is under attack when it's produced verdicts that are not in one line with the government policy. As our president said 2 days ago, the checks and balances is not working as it used to work before. And I'll give a couple of examples. So last year, the government of Israel passed a law so-called the transparency law, also known as the anti-NGO bill, or law, which is limiting the work of civil society. Now, as far as I know, in a democratic country, you do want to have a vibrant civil society, and when you have only one voice, you don't call it democracy anymore. And some of it, obviously, in the occupied territories, people are familiar with this a long time ago, but I'm speaking within the democratic Israel. And this bill that was dealing with transparency said we want to know what money is coming out of Israel, which is great. I'm for transparency. That's a great idea. Let's see who's sponsoring whom. But it was not for everybody. We didn't need this bill. Every NGO in Israel is already reporting if we're receiving money. So I mean, go on my website or obviously to the authorities. They know exactly who's giving me money. So we don't need this bill. So let's scratch what's behind it. So this law was designated in a way designed to catch those organizations that are working in the occupied territory. So it was about money that is coming outside, but not all the money that is coming outside of Israel. Only governments, but in the law is calling it foreign entities. When you hear foreign entities, you would think, wow, North Korea is actually supporting them. So the answer no. The friendly governments or foreign entities that are supporting us, for example, are the US government, the European Union, Scandinavian governments, and others. So they're supporting, as far as I read in the papers, that they're supporting the state of Israel as well in many fields. But when it comes to me, an organization like us, they're becoming foreign entities. The third thing, that we're speaking only about governments and not about individuals. As Chagai said before, Israel Today, that is most distributed newspaper in Israel, that is given free, sponsored by one person out of the country, which is Sheldon Edelson. Now, they don't need to report who's sponsoring them because it's not a government. Apparently, the friendly governments that are sponsoring NGOs in Israel want to strengthen democracy. Okay, so in the end of the day, organizations, NGOs that are getting more than 50% of their income from friendly governments have to report they're under scrutiny in a big way. So this is one example, but not the only one. Our minority is 20% of the Israeli citizens, speaking within Israel, yes, are the Palestinian Israelis, what we call, and they are going through legislation. The worst one, from my opinion, is the impeachment law, which the elected majority in the Knesset, in our parliament, can decide to remove the elected minority. Okay? Let's say it again. The elected majority can decide to remove the elected minority. This passed by a law. It's challenged in the Supreme Court by us and other organizations today. And I think in terms of, the pillars of democracy is not only the rule of majority, there's the second one with the minority. And here we're speaking of shrinking democratic space and relating also to freedom of press. These are things that we're worried about.
All right, so I want to go to Hagai next, and I want to finish this with that because I'm trying to, these actually sort of link together. Speaking about the shrinking space, what you've been discussing, what you're talking about, and those of us who read 972 know, in many ways, as the space, as there's been more pressure on the traditional media, the alternative media has jumped in. And we're seeing that all over the world. Citizen journalists, you can't get a camera in as a television journalist, but you can get your iPhone in and video the whole thing. Active stills with their images, which are on your website, are amazing. Talk to me a little bit about how alternative media is jumping in, and how already, if it's happening, or how much you anticipate, the hammer coming down on that as well. It's like the Facebook piece of it. It seems as if this is going to be a constantly moving target. At this point, the Israeli government must have long understood you can have gag orders, but the information still comes out in the United States press. You can have censorship, but the data still comes out somewhere. So how do you see that interacting as the illiberal wave continues to wash over Israeli society? That pressure for you.
Okay. Well, first, you just mentioned active stills, and active stills are a collective of photographers that we work with. One of the photographers from active stills was arrested in Jerusalem in the story that Sharon was talking about, when he got around some of the police barricades, and he was arrested. He was a Palestinian. Faisal Bouhamne was arrested by police just for trying to take pictures for our outlets. In the whole drama in Jerusalem just last summer, this is also a chance to mention that while we are under attack, it's nothing compared to the attack that Palestinian journalists are suffering from, as Palestinian journalists can be shot at and beaten and held in administrative detention, which means months on end without charge or trial, just because an army officer decides that they would be. So, a proportion to the incitement and all the things we're experiencing, that's much worse. But at the same time, yes, I think that alternative media does have a role to play in challenging and undermining and going around and finding ways to spread information that mainstream media feels that it's a trap, because it's somewhat established, it has its relations with the idea of spokesperson, with the government spokesperson, and so on. They feel that they're kind of limited in their ability to maneuver, whereas alternative media has much more freedom. We appear everywhere. Like I said, people with cameras anywhere can report to us, can be much more dynamic. And it's harder to restrict. At the same time, it means that we might also be, luckily we haven't experienced it this far, more susceptible to pressure as we have less resources to deal with legal attacks, lawsuits, and so on. So if we do come under such attacks in the future, and we might, then it would be harder for us to deal with them.
All right, so Suhad, picking it up from there. So what I understand, and I've followed obviously justice for years and the work there, and then now with Local Call. The idea is to have this transformative media that comes and people sort of gets below the radar in some ways, politically, socially, get into the stories. I'm interested in, you know, for me as an American for years growing up, the idea that there was censorship in Israel was always hard for me to sort of trying to understand my idea of democratic Israel, which everybody, you know, giving their articles to censors was very organic. That was always hard to understand. The Israelis seem to just take that in stride. That's part of being a democracy in the pressure cooker of the Middle East. I'd be interested if you would talk about how receptive people are to this alternative way of bringing the stories. And Local Call really specializes in bringing a human voice. It's not so much a dry political journalistic analysis, it's a human voice reporting what's going on and giving insight. How effective that is at sort of getting past the cynicism or the security arguments or whatever. Particularly in a society where, I mean, I saw something today that, you know, only 51% of Israelis think Arabic should still be an official language. I mean, you have this sort of, you know, growing hardening of views in some ways we see at the same time.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, to take a step back, one of the things that we as a team have been looking at trying to tackle through the work that we do is a few different things. One is to inspire action, to get people to really know about what's happening on the ground so that they can get involved, support these efforts, and mobilize. Another is to actually connect the dots between communities that have been divided. And one of the things to really hold centrally here is that the divide and conquer strategy over time, for prolonged periods of time, works. And it's not only separation of Israeli and Palestinian society in all of the geographical forms that we know, the separation of the West Bank, of the Gaza Strip, a wall literally ripping through a region that has historically always been combined and a jointed space. It's also the psychological barriers, and it's also the very concerted government strategies that have been employed to create entire blackouts of what's happening for communities just minutes from one another. And I'll take a step back to say when Yael initially started talking to editorial boards about to identify, can we actually work within the established institutions in Israel? She would talk to journalists who would say, look, I would love to cover these stories, and I've tried to cover these stories a gazillion times, have written these beautiful pieces, and they're fantastic journalists. By the time it gets up to the editorial board, it gets spit out, you can't even recognize it. It's hardly what was presented in the initial form. Then she would talk to editorial team members who would say, we do not care about what's happening for communities 2 minutes down the road from us, literally. If it's not part of the mainstream discourse, Palestinians are considered a national security issue. They're considered a foreign affairs issue insofar as how we operate. We're telling stories about what's happening in Israel, and by that we mean Jewish, Israeli, Israel, right? And I think that is a really important thing to hold. Now, what was so important and I think this surprised both Hagai and I when we initially launched, when we were launching Sakam Meet, the strategy that we were employing, the way that Just Vision envisioned it, was that, like our documentary films, what we were actually doing is forcing audiences to pay attention to a story that they wouldn't otherwise have access to, and then have to shape their opinion, or so on. In the context of this, our target was to force the mainstream media to have to contend with our narratives that we were presenting. Now, we knew we were up against the challenge, and like those editors said to us, look, Israelis don't care about this. That's what they said to us over and over and over again. For over a decade, that's what we would hear. And so we thought, look, if we got 30,000 readers in the first year, we've done our job. Like, that's a good goal to set. What we didn't realize is that we were actually being founded in April of 2014, and there would be a number of tragedies that would take place in consecutive order following that launch that would force us into the breaking news cycle right off the bat. So several of you may remember that there were 3 young Israelis who were kidnapped and murdered. The murder was withheld from the Israeli public. It was used to justify a military campaign against Palestinians across the West Bank under the pretext of trying to find the boys. There was a young Palestinian boy who was murdered by extreme Israeli right-wing settlers as a revenge attack. And all while this is going on, there's also the Gaza war that begins in 2014, where Gaza is completely flattened by the Israeli government. Now, what ends up happening is we end up becoming the only resource that's telling stories of what's happening in the occupied Palestinian territories as communities in Hebron and Nablus and Jenin were getting raided over and over again for 6 weeks. We were the only ones who were actually interviewing the family members of Mohammed Abu Qader, who was killed. And we were the only ones who actually had journalists in Gaza who were reporting directly, consistently for that entire period during the Gaza war. All of a sudden, we were watching our readership spike. So we went from, we had 30,000 readers in the first 2 weeks. We had over 200,000 within the first 6 weeks of launch. We initially had started off with a guy as an editor for Local Call from 972 and Yael Marom as an editor for Local Call, and they were completely flooded, working around the clock 24 hours a day. What this told us was a couple of things. One, the idea that the Israeli public is not interested in these stories is false. That may be true to a certain degree, but when you actually put that information out there, if you strategically deploy it, and you're doing it in a quality that is professional and of excellence and can compete with the mainstream media product, then you can actually garner attention. Now, the second thing that I'll say that I think is really important, this is what I ground in when I get lost in the big abstraction that often happens around Israel-Palestine. Yael Marom, during that summer, was walking down the street in Tel Aviv. Just a couple of days prior, she was actually at a protest of Israelis who were organizing against the war. That guy was also there, and he had a beautiful piece published in the Forward around what happened, what would follow. At that protest, the police stood back as a right-wing mob literally came in with clubs and bats to beat down the protesters. Now, so she's walking down the street, Yael is walking down the street a couple of days later in Tel Aviv, and a woman yells from across the street, "You're that person from Meko Meats." Meko Meats had just launched. And she's sitting there, not exactly sure what to expect. Is this person about to attack me? What's going to happen? The woman runs across the street and says, "I recognize you because of your caricature." So each writer has a caricature on Meko Meats. And I just wanted to say thank you. I had no idea that there were others out there that held my political views. Now, I'm a queer woman speaking, and I believe in the power of visibility. There is power in visibility, both in terms of encouraging and moving others to take a step up, but also in protection. And one of the things that we know is that Local Call is both an effort to inform the public with stories that they wouldn't otherwise have, and we know that they're interested in them. And the other piece is to make sure that those audiences then have a way of activating and a community to actually activate with. And I think this is something that as Americans and for any of us who care about what's happening in our backyards, being able to have both of those things actually is crucially important in both maintaining long-term sustained movements and to being able to effectively coordinate and organize so that we're protecting everyone's well-being, especially when we have people in power who's trying to divide and conquer.
Okay, I have one more question, and I'm actually going to hand this to each of you if you want to talk about it. I'm interested in focusing on the journalism side of it, the line between journalism and activism. This is something that I think any really courageous and good journalist wrestles with, right? And in a situation like what you have in Israel and to some extent today, when honest journalism looks, or it's condemned as activism, having facts are condemned as opinion or treated as opinion when there are no facts. How when you are engaging as journalists, as people who engage journalists, support journalists, defend journalists, where do you draw the line, and to what extent is it possible today to draw a clear line between journalism and activism for free speech, for example? And you can just take this in whatever order you wish. You don't have to respond even.
Okay, I think there's definitely an increased burden of proof that comes from two things. One is the attack on the side of the media, and the other is the fact that we are very transparent about who we are. As a media outlet, we have a position. We are against the occupation. We support social justice and peace in our country. I mean, this is a position of both 972 magazine and Local Call. This is what we believe in. We're very, very outspoken about it. And that creates a burden of proof. That means that we would be looked at as, those leftists. And that's fine. I think it's our responsibility to say, in spite of this, this does not mean that there is no truth. This does not mean that facts don't matter. And it's our responsibility to show our audiences, and we try to do this all the time, using as many links as possible, links to PDFs and documents and footage, and whatever we can to allow readers to trace how we reach a certain conclusion, to see the facts themselves, like the raw material, something that journalists in the past would not do. They would not show the document that they're relying on. We would put a link into the document itself, we could upload it and put links so people could read the entire document and reach the same decision or a different one. But they would see that we are based on facts. So it means a lot of more work. It means making sure that all these resources are transparent. But it's important specifically because we're politically motivated, and because people like Netanyahu and Trump are trying to get people to think that there is no truth. So it's a cause to fight for, that there is a truth out there.
So I'll respond on two levels. One as storyteller, and then also in terms of how we think about comical meats. So from the lens of Just Vision's storytelling work, one of the things that we believe in is accountable storytelling. This is driven from the fact that we don't actually believe that journalists or storytellers generally are objective. Everyone brings a point of view. We may have said that there was objective journalism at one point in history. I would argue around that. That everyone actually brings a lens to everything that they do. The question for us is, can we actually make sure that it's factual, that it's accurate, and that it accurately represents the people that we're talking about and the context that they're in. Those are key principles for our filmmaking work, for our journalistic work, for our public engagement work. So in practice, what does that look like? In practice, I'll give you an example of something that we're doing right now. We're about to launch a new film. We're actually sitting down. We've been interviewing people for this project. We've been working on it for about 4 years. We've had about 6 different archival researchers fact-checking for that 4 years. We've worked with about 24 different women who have contributed their stories to this project. We've worked through all of their personal files, and we've drilled down in all of the mainstream media outlets that existed during the period of time that our next film focuses on. We're now sitting down with each of the protagonists to have them watch the film to make sure it's accurate and that it fairly represents who they are from every point of view that they're bringing in the story. That's important because we, at the end of the day, as an organization, our obligation is to the ground. It's to the people who, and the communities, Palestinians and Israelis, who are doing this work and whose voices we're trying to amplify. Now, from the journalistic lens, with Sikam Meets, there were a couple of things that we knew from the get-go. We knew that we were bringing a point of view to Sikam Meets. We wanted to make sure that very specific voices made it into the mainstream arena. Those were Palestinian and Israeli human rights defenders, activists, community organizers, folks who had something to say, but who never were brought onto the stage to say it, whether that's at Channel 2 or Channel 10 or Yediot Ahronoth or what have you. The second thing we knew is that we wanted to make sure that we were professional, that we were also restoring to some degree a set of standards of journalistic integrity. And so what that meant for us is that we actually, together with 972, built a cadre of about initially 28 volunteer writers and bloggers who each represented different struggles that they were involved in. We provided them the training and the tools so that they could become writers. Some of them were veteran journalists, so they already had those tools. Some of them were rising activists who never thought that they would ever write a piece, who never wanted to address the public necessarily on a national level platform. But after that, the thing that binds them is a set of values that we're all committed to, and we're very transparent about it. We're committed to freedom of expression, we're committed to equality for all peoples in the region, we're committed to an end to occupation, and we're committed to human and civil rights and transparency. And so that's the precedent that then determines our editorial structure, and the organizations are actually separate from the editors. So the way it's set up is that the editorial team for Sikam Meet actually drives the editorial direction. 972 and Just Vision drive strategy, management, day-to-day, make sure that ultimately we're working like publishers. Where we would ever sort of intervene is if there's a defiance of the set of values that we have already put into place. And so that's a very complicated conversation, especially when you're looking at so many different dynamics playing out on the ground and between communities and points of view on different issues. But I think it's important for us to be both transparent about that and then also have safeguards in place to make sure that we are operating under a certain set of standards.
So I'm the lawyer, we're dinosaurs in many ways, in terms of the factual basis. So being a reader and a consumer of media, I think a big problem is getting the greater picture. Before we submit petitions or before we write papers, we have to make sure that we know the facts. But how do we get all the facts? And I want to rely on what Khaled was saying. January 18 in Al-Khiran in the Bedouin village, one of my lawyers is a Bedouin woman who was working actually in Al-Khiran. She heard about it at night, but she couldn't get in because there was closure. They got in hours before the closure. Now, we are sitting in the morning, we have a conversation, 10 a.m., a video conversation, our office in Nazareth, she's we are Israeli lawyers, we're sitting in Nazareth, we're sitting in Tel Aviv, and we're saying, okay, 2 people were killed in the past couple of hours, we know this village, we're representing them, we're working with them, Adala is representing them actually, and we are trying to figure out what has happened, and we don't have the information. The police spokesperson at 10:30 a.m. already said, this is an ISIS man. My lawyer is saying, I know him, he's a deputy principal in school, he has nothing to do with ISIS. So, what do you say? You don't say nothing? I mean, it's unfair not to say nothing, and I'm a human rights organization, 2 people were killed, I should say something. But if I'm saying, he's an ISIS person because this is the information I've got, it's not reliable. Can I say anything else? I was waiting for them to say something. So we ended up saying what, as a human rights organization, we said, A, stop now the evacuation of the village, 2 people are killed, stop it now and revisit what is happening here. And B, we need an investigation committee for the events over there. It took a couple of months until the government said, oh, sorry, the thing we said at 10 a.m. that morning were not accurate. So it's really hard, for me as a lawyer to find the facts and to relate in a reliable way. And I think one of the things about ACRI is that we're dinosaurs. I'm laughing in some sense, but I think we're very reliable in what we are doing. So whenever we're saying things, we are being taken very serious. But it takes time to say something without knowledge, and that's why I think both of you are doing a great job for us.
Yeah, it's listening to you, it strikes me that for a long time now, but maybe now more than ever, my question may have been flipped, because it's more that activists are obligated to act as the most responsible journalists, as opposed to journalists being more activists. I'm thinking about some of the work that all of us have done on the activism side, where you footnote everything, you link everything, and you say, look, facts matter. You can disagree with my point of view, but you can't dispute my facts. And that's increasingly, I think, how everyone in the progressive space has to behave, perhaps on every issue. All right, so I'm going to open up to questions now, but first I'm going to apologize to Tali and company for forgetting to mention NIF. In my mind, I'm always thinking about our partner and our friends and also a grantee, and they're awesome, and we're very, very pleased to be co-sponsoring this event with them, so my apologies for that. I know you'll forgive me eventually. But we have a little over half an hour open for questions. So, from the floor, Elaine.
I don't want to divert too far from the topic as announced, but my interests, in addition to supporting the 2 publications here, and ACRI, and NIF, are in the world of the arts. And the discussion about storytelling sort of aligns, at least. It's my understanding that on the cultural front, the Israeli scene is becoming more and more threatened in terms of expression. It's not always about facts, it's about perceptions or ideas. Would any of you like to speak to what's happening to the Minister of Culture and the theater world and support for films and the travel of artists and how you see that connecting to your own work.
And Elaine, that is completely within the purview of this event, so thank you.
Yeah, that is something also, I mean, we're focusing on media, but it's definitely just one part of this ongoing attack. Charlotte mentioned our President Hibin's speech just 2 days ago about, he actually used the word coup by the government against other democratic institutions. And one of these fields is definitely the field of culture, where suddenly we're seeing the threat of cutting funding to film, to theater, for either being in any way sympathetic to a message against occupation, or for supporting someone that is showing a message against occupation. So we see it's becoming contagious. That a poet wrote a song against occupation, she was arrested. Then a theater in Jaffa had a solidarity evening to support that poet in freedom of information and freedom of speech. Now that theater is coming under attack and might lose their government funding just for being in solidarity with that poet. So these things are happening in all these different fields at the same time. And it's terrible, I don't know. There's no say.
So our Minister of Culture, Mir Regev, is occupying us pretty much. This year we have a couple of letters, petitions, corresponding. What she's doing, the allocation of budget to theaters and to the arts is now under the condition whether the theater is performing in the settlements in the occupied territories. So we challenge it in the Supreme Court, still pending, we're waiting for the verdict. And basically, definitely restrictions on arts and freedom of expression, on culture, because we want our culture to be, aligned with the government's view, which again, going back to democracy limitation.
Mark Harrison, United Methodist Church. I gathered found me. Laura, very quickly, the people who use a footnote to the limit, and people will still say it's facts don't mean nothing. The point is, so people inside of Israel who are interested in receiving this information, this news, this quote, a real view of what's happening. So when people get this information, what do you hope to see happen next? What organizations can they be involved in? What kind of, it's like, you get this information, you want to see something happen to it and to make change. So how do you all read that?
That's a great question. So I'll situate Jeff's vision in that question, and Mark, thank you for that. First, I think it's really important to underscore that this is a vast ecosystem, that there's a number of organizations that are chipping away at this issue from a number of different lenses. We happen to be situated in one very specific realm, which is around media and shifting the narrative. The piece that's so important for us is knowing and I think it's really helpful potentially for you, is that ultimately this is a network building strategy. That's what movement building is all about. So once folks enter into this work, whether they're inspired or they're more informed or what have you, it's about finding ways to work with partners, whether that's FNUP or 972 or ACRI, to plug people in. You can find more information on our website around different organizations that are in the field on the ground doing phenomenal work to get more involved in. And the other piece to it is working in allyship with different organizations. So oftentimes, for example, with any of our films, we oftentimes will equip activists in different organizations with those films to be tools as recruiting mechanisms for their own work, or to be able to convene and activate their memberships on the ground. Ultimately, I think the question has to be around who the specific person is. There's a lot of different ways to engage on this issue, and it's depending on where one is in the change spectrum, the first thing may be to say, please pick up 972, put it as your homepage browser, and start reading about what's actually taking place on the ground. Ultimately, we want to get political change on this issue. Ultimately, we want to make sure that all populations in Israel and Palestine have a rights-respecting society to live in, that people are treated equally and with respect, and that the well-being of everyone is taken care of. That's a long-term strategy when we're looking at something that is so deeply entrenched in terms of social norms and views on what's happening on the ground. And so that's where we're situated as an organization, but there's a lot of other ones that, like working with J Street, or working with TRUA, or working with JVP, or US Campaign, or APN, and so many others who are doing constituency building political advocacy.
I think like very just something small. For me, as a journalist, I don't think. I mean, I want to get people to become activists. I'm also a political activist. I want people to go out there. But as a media outlet, I don't think that it's my role to tell people, okay, you've read this article, now go join this party, or now go and be part of that organization. I don't think that's my role. I think that we have a role to raise awareness, to spread information, but like one day I can write about an ACRI petition, and then the next I might criticize ACRI. So because I don't like something they did, or they failed somewhere, maybe.
This is democracy.
Exactly. So so I won't be telling people, go join ACRI tomorrow, because I might be critical of them for some other reason. But we do see, that aside, we do see people that read Local Call, that read 972 magazine, and find the path to becoming political activists. They see different groups and grassroots initiatives that are being covered in our outlets that don't get any media coverage elsewhere. And just by knowing that these exist, we don't have to call upon people to go there, but just by knowing that these groups exist, they would join them. So I think we can definitely take some credit for that.
I would also just have this question here, but just going to add, I mean, there's some apples and oranges here. I mean, some of what we're talking about here is how you address the Israeli and Palestinian public on the ground. And what Safad was referencing there was how you engage in the United States, which are complementary actions, obviously, but doing different things. All right, so you're
Well, actually, you
yes.
took a
Oh,
good
sorry,
segue.
no.
No. Good segue to my question, apropos of what you discussed about Israel. Could you address what kind of receptivity you have gotten here in the United States among the congressional arena, opinion makers, media here? Are you seeing any impact? Are people reading 972 magazine other than the people sitting around this table here in the United States? And what kind of, where do you see it going, and have you made any roots take hold?
If you check the Clinton letters, I think you'll see that Hillary Clinton also is reading 972 magazine. There are definitely some references there.
What about currently? Current.
No, I don't know about current leaders. We try to get them to follow our tweets. But
how much of your readership is in the United States?
For 972 magazine, it's a huge percentage. We have over 1 million readers annually, and about half is in North America. So there's definitely, and we definitely are followed and read by diplomats, by congressmen. We know this because we're being approached for comments, for follow-ups, for briefings by the embassy in Tel Aviv specifically on occasion, but also when we travel, when we're here with others.
But like in your visit here, like right now, are you making visits to Capitol Hill? Are you making visits to AIPAC? Are you making visits to
You don't have to tell us your
opinion makers, to people who write columns, to George F. Will, to Thomas Friedman? I mean, do you meet with these people, or you wait for them simply to ask you to come by if they know you're here?
On our side, we're not as good as we should be in creating these contacts. We usually are just blessed by people coming to us. We're not as good in creating those contacts yet. It's definitely part of our program for development. We haven't gotten to that, but we have the program to develop over the coming 2 years, and part of it is creating that kind of direct outreach here as well. So far we've just been getting this attention, which is wonderful, but not initiating.
But I would urge you to initiate.
You're right.
So I think just really briefly on this question, I think one of the things to hold is to what end. So who are you engaging and to what end? What are you trying to move them to? Just Vision believes in engagement, in that we recognize that ultimately the grassroots are going to lead. It's actually your folks at the front lines in resistance today who are pushing the edge of conversation that has been stuck for a very long time in the political domain. Our role, to some degree, is both to amplify those efforts, but also to help connect the dots between the top, which is often operating in a silo separate from the grassroots. So what that does look like is, on occasion, working with the World Economic Forum, the European Parliament, the American Congress, engaging presidents. I've gone into brief President Obama, I've gone into brief the National Security Council, actually asking them and requesting that they change the way that they speak about certain things, that they actually acknowledge the Israeli human rights defenders and Palestinian political activists that are working on the ground. But ultimately, this goes back to the question, the sort of piece that I think Haggai is speaking to, which is what is the role of each organization or team? For us, our aim ultimately is to shift the way those players are thinking, to make sure this is part of the conversation, and to help put the stories and the facts in front of them that force them to behave differently. So for example, you might remember President Obama's Cairo speech in 2009, where he celebrated nonviolent action from across the Middle East, yet condemned Palestinians for not adopting nonviolence. Yet, for any of those of us who have been paying attention to what's happening in the region, we know that there's a long legacy of Palestinian nonviolent civil resistance dating back for decades, including the First Intifada, which is recognized as one of the most transformative social change movements, not only in the region, but arguably one of the most effective civil resistance movements around the globe. And yet, our president of the United States did not have this at his fingertips. We actually walked in and said, look, you made a mistake in that, going back to this piece about having to be accurate. Like, these are all of the accounts of nonviolent civil resistance. And it actually encouraged him to reframe the way that he was talking about Palestinian resistance when he went to the region in Jerusalem for the first time. So I think the piece that the piece that I just want to hold is that the question becomes, when is it strategic to engage, given the role that we play with these different players, and asking the question of, to what end, what are we trying to do?
Okay, so you, and then Sarah.
I wanted to say,
Oh, sorry.
Our primarily target population is the Israeli decision makers. We do have on our website, and we do have mailing lists, informative mailing lists, which, as I said, accurate factual basis, both in English and in Hebrew. And we are being approached by international community for questions and clarifications about several things, but our main operation is to the Israeli decision makers.
All right, Stephen.
Okay, part of it is always like seeing the web of how fact-based storytelling through journalism, documentaries and other things is linked with activism. And based on what you said about being a storyteller and the notion of objective journalism, people coming with a point of view, there are other storytellers on the scene. So I want to sort of ask you granularly within Israeli society, the other storytellers in our view, are manipulating fear and denial. And there's a lot more than that. But they're out there storytelling in the rooms, in the living rooms, in the cafes, away from even their own political activism and the political activists of the human rights and communities. A discussion within Israeli society goes on. Could you speak a little bit more about, in the living room level, what you hope from your engagements?
It's a tough one. I think, no, it's an important one. No, you're definitely right. I would say what I hope to get when I write, when I bring people a story, is for them to realize the way that there is an interconnection between their lives and those of others around them. I think this is something that is often misunderstood in the Israeli society. How there's kind of this concept that the occupation is far away. You know, it can be 5 minutes, literally 5 minutes away, but it's far away conceptually, and therefore, you know, it's irrelevant to my life. Someone might think there are families being evicted from their homes, Israeli families, like Jewish families, being evicted from their homes because they're living in poor residence, being evicted. That's not relevant to my life. And we're trying to get people to see themselves as part of a society that the stories of other people are affecting them as well. I think that may be if you're talking about a sentiment within the living room and not like news, just getting people to conceive of themselves as one society living in this land, that is, I think, maybe the one thing they aspire for most.
So I'll take it in a different direction and kind of go macro. On our end, you know, what we want to ultimately see happen is a change in the narrative. For example, with Boudreaux's, right, the film about the first successful Palestinian-led nonviolent campaign to stop the Israeli separation wall from being built on their lands, destroying the village. We wanted to change the narrative from the dominant narrative, which is often that these kinds of efforts are illegitimate. They are of thugs, rioters, anarchists who are breaking the law and order, thereby justifying their arrests, to a narrative that says nonviolent movements who are organizing for rights and dignity on this issue are not only legitimate, they're justified, and we need to be paying attention to them. And anyone who is worth their salt on this issue ought to be listening to the grassroots if they want to be holistic in really understanding what's taking place on the ground and what are the opportunities for change and pressure points.
So my motivation in working is I'm descendant to Holocaust survivors, and I think the universal values. So as a nation that in the recent history have been a minority that was the rights were violated in a very harsh way, I think we shouldn't be only in a position that we see only ourselves. And there is a value to the greater picture. Now, it's harder in the digital area when we are in silos, right? Each one of us has the network, and the algorithm works like this, that everybody agree with us. Oh, that's beautiful. And sometimes from the other universe, you have something crossing your feed, and whoa, really, it happens there. So I don't know how it, this is the most important thing for me, and I think it goes via personal stories as well, because you know, when we take a map and we draw the line, it's not something that is really working. I mean, history is proven it's not working. And I think we should strive for this, you know, as human beings. I mean, for me, this is the thing.
Beautiful. Sir, that.
Okay. Steve Winters. There's another long-standing narrative on the progressive left, which probably I would just call the anti-colonial narrative. For example, in the statement attributed to Prime Minister Netanyahu that our struggle against the Palestinians is our Algerian war, but unlike the French, we aren't going to lose it. So putting it in that context. And when Mr. Salem from Brookings spoke at MEI just several weeks ago, his interlocutor sort of brought this up, and you could see the distinction of the two viewpoints. So how do you respond to the anti-colonial narrative?
By Netanyahu?
Huh?
I think, to me, this is at times quite helpful. I mean, I think it can be a helpful tool for discourse in different scenarios. Like in Israel, for example, usually it isn't. Talking with Israelis, it's not like saying what we're doing is colonialism. It usually doesn't, you know, ring any bells, doesn't bring up any kind of association. People would say, oh, actually that's a bad thing to do. We should stop it. So I wouldn't use that term in an internal Israeli discourse. However, outside of Israel, with speaking to Palestinian friends and hearing them describe their struggle as anti-colonial and part of an international historic tradition of resisting colonialism, I think that has value, and the same goes for different international forums. So in different places you use a different language. I think that definitely makes sense.
Thanks for the question. So I think one of the things that I would just encourage is, and just kind of remind us of, is for a very long time, even using the word occupation on this issue was taboo, right? It still is in certain spheres. I still get the question, Sahad, do you have to use the word occupation every single time you talk about this issue? Yes, I do, because we need to actually name things for what they are so that we could tackle them at their root. And so I think I'm going to take a step back from this anti-colonial piece, because I think the context in which it's being used actually deeply matters for me to be able to respond on whether I think it makes sense or not in any given space. But I think that being able, even when it's difficult, because it comes with loaded histories, or it comes with a guilt, or it comes with actually a responsibility to then have to do something when something is named. It's actually incumbent on those of us who care about establishing equal rights and communities who are respected despite their ethnic or religious identities, to actually name things for what they are. And so that's the bigger picture frame that is really important, I think. And then to Hagai's point is also recognizing how to communicate with different audiences in a way that one can hear each other. And when you're actually sacrificing principles and values to do that.
There's never black and white. I mean, it's really complicated, and I think part of the, I was speaking about universalism, but on the other hand, the national sentiment or the feeling of people is genuine in both sides, and I think it's a lot about recognition, education, speaking of, and that's why I see, again, as I'm going back to the same point of democracy, having a conversation is really important. Speaking about colonialism, and then other people in the room can say, yeah, but our conflict is unique because 1, 2, 3 go. So it's whatever it is, it needs to be spoken. And at this stage, I think one of the reasons we're having this panel that the space is getting smaller, and we don't have this conversation as much as we should have.
I would just add, I've working in this field for a long time. It is in parallel, as the space is shrinking and as the possibility for peace along two states seems more remote, the arguments about colonialism are resurgent. I mean, Israel got a pass for a very, very long time. It could say, no, we're in the process of negotiating so Palestinians can have a state. Don't even get into that. It's as that very possibility has receded along with this illiberal tide that these arguments come in and they resound so strongly for so many of them, because there isn't really, the behavior is increasingly impossible to contextualize. Yes, it's complicated, but this is wrong. Or, yes, it's complicated, but you're not showing any other options. So I think it speaks directly to this closing space, this occupied space for speech, that these arguments become the ones that we have to contend with. All right, we have time for a couple more. Sir, and then you.
My name is Sherban. I'm a lawyer here in the district, and I spent a lot of the time this summer on the ground in Israel and Palestine with Al-Haq, it's a Palestinian human rights organization. And one of the things they told us was about how they'd lost hundreds of thousands of dollars by their funding sources overseas being attacked. And I know that the same thing is happening with the Israeli human rights groups. We were with Breaking the Silence and Adala and other groups. And I was wondering if you could talk about that more. I mean, not only are they being criticized directly at the sources of funding, but they're being, there's laws passed which require disclosure of where foreign funding is coming from. And I know that's already in effect, but my understanding is another round of that is coming, that there's another, so if you could address that.
Where to start from? Every day we have something else, but in general, as I said, the people that are investing in human rights around the world, I mean, at least my organization, as I said, transparent, so we have Israeli people that are supporting us, Jewish Israeli people. American Jews are supporting when they want to see the state of Israel as a democratic space, and we have international support like governments. when there is no process, no hope, no nothing, I mean, what we witnessed in the last couple of years is that the international interest is less and less, and that's probably what you experience in Al-Haq. I'm not familiar with their finance, but I can speak about organizations, that are NGOs that are working in the occupied territories in Israel. NGO bills probably had influence to some extent. Probably governments, if I was a foreign government and I want to invest somewhere in the other part of the world, I would think about hope and want to see some results after so-and-so years. Maybe I said, no, maybe it's not the best use of my money. There are other places in the world that can make use of this money. Stage 1 of the NGO bill passed last year will come to effect this year. There are other suggestions, various suggestions what to do with what I spoke before about foreign money. I can't relate to everything seriously. You know, whenever something new is coming, we're saying, okay, should we address it seriously or should we let it go? So I'm not sure if it's really, it's not substantial at this stage, but who knows, you know, like I just read in the papers today that on Sunday the government wants to declare annexation of part of the West Bank. So whether it's going to be or not, I don't know, you want to add?
And just there's a few resources that I can share that speaks a little bit more to the funding dynamics on this issue, both in terms of the impact of international aid on the region's detriments and the role of strangulating resources for organizations that are working on human rights-based issues.
So my question is more focused on the media and Sharon's comment about the silos. So first, one factual question. Is 972 only in English?
972 magazine is in English and local call is in Hebrew, and the two translate from between.
I guess the question was, when you talk about mainstream media, talk to me a little more about what you mean the role of TV news in that. And also, we have the non-mainstream media on the right. I don't know if it's Russian press or settler press or whatever it is. Is there any experience of this on their end as well, or is it only on the left, which is what we all know?
In terms of the attacks?
Yeah, and this is the increased censorship and some of the other things that
Our
you mentioned.
shows.
Right.
And the role of the non-mainstream media on the right.
First of all, actually, I mean, you wouldn't think, but actually some extreme right-wing media outlets in Israel are suffering from limitations. And two people writing for one of the most extreme outlets of the settler right have been put in administrative detention for a very, very short while. I think it was like 2 days or a week. I don't remember for now.
I don't remember, but we are against administrative detention that was used historically against Palestinians, and now we're defending the right wing as well. We're consistent about human rights and administrative detention is a bad idea.
So it does happen on occasion. Mostly the government encourages right-wing alternative media or kind of fringe media. They're trying to give them more of a platform right these days. But on occasion there are some outlets that are so extreme that even the government is kind of having a hard time swallowing. And I think the whole issue with the silos, with the bubbles, with the fact that the more we consume information through social media and less through a proper news show or a newspaper where there's an editor deciding this is important and this isn't. And I was critical about this before. I mentioned when we were talking about those editors. When I used to work in Ma'ariv, a big newspaper in Israel, I would go and pitch stories about just welfare issues and housing issues of Arab citizens within Israel, and I was told by my editor, oh, it's an Arab family, that's not a story. So I had experienced those things, and at the same time, I do see the value of there being mass media, of there being big outlets that people that read, like, a little bit of Lancet to a local column, a little bit of here, a little bit of there, that there is some shared basis of information for wide segments of society. If you want to be able to hold political debate, you can't all have the information from your self-resonating echo chamber of a feed. We need mainstream media to create a basis for common dialogue. At that point, I would criticize mainstream media for what kind of a discourse it's creating and what it's missing out on. That's my role as alternative media, but their role as being there and being a unifying force for political discourse is very, very important.
I think just to add to that, just to make it, to kind of provide a couple of examples that I think illustrate some of this. Our team, I had talked about our work trying to reach the Israeli mainstream media for a number of years and seeing a couple of different things happening in that space, right? One of the things that was happening very frequently is that we would actually try to work with major outlets, broadcast, and in one case we actually worked with a major broadcast station in Israel that seemed to present as friendly, conducted a 30-minute interview, and then when it actually aired, it was completely manipulated, chopped up, and not reflective at all of what was discussed during the full interview or what was pitched to us as an interview initially. This is something that happens too frequently on this issue, right? It's one of the reasons that Sikha Mekumid actually has become a very trusted source on the ground. It's why Palestinian communities come to Sikha Mekumid to say, you're the only one that I trust with this. Or whistleblowers come to Sikha Mekumid and say, I probably will get more readership or more airtime on Channel 2 if they actually pick this up, but I don't trust them to do this correctly. So we're scooping investigative stories right now that nobody else has access to because of the lack of trust in these outlets for either manipulation or in some cases just outright, as the guy has said, they're Palestinian, we're not talking to them. We don't care to hear their voice, right? And so I think that this is something that there's a crisis in the mainstream media globally. We see it here in the United States. The amounts of coverage on news, I've realized at this point, I could watch 2 hours of news and have the same story on loop for 2 hours while everything else in our backyards are burning, and I have no access to what's happening unless I actually am being really diligent about finding other news sources. That is a problem. It means that the press is failing to do its job. And the work that Just Vision does, the work that 972 does, is ultimately to be a challenge to the mainstream media, to step up, to say, look, you have a responsibility in telling a more holistic story about what's happening in our backyards, because your role is to inform the public so that we could actually make informed decisions about the political questions that are on the table that impact our lives. And that is, whether it's broadcast or it's print or it's what have you, that's our role. I think in terms of the right wing, there's one of the things that I would just offer to the conversation as something to chew on is thinking about there's certainly these right wing outlets, and they certainly are being, Hagai talked about a couple of instances of administrative detention and so on. Understanding how well resourced, funded, and supported they are becomes really critical in understanding the landscape that we're operating in. When you have billionaires like Sheldon Adelson operating outlets both in the United States and Israel, and single-handedly funding the distribution of free papers in Israel to become the most well-read paper in the country, we have work to be done, and it will require resources, and it will require diligence, and it will also require recognizing that these are not separate or exceptional cases in Israel and Palestine. It's not exceptional what we're seeing here. It's not exceptional what we're seeing in Europe. This is actually a concerted effort.
Actually, I want to add to that. What's also not exceptional is the Sheldon Adelson piece of it, or the U.S. side of this. We have to face that as we're having a conversation about shrinking the space. The current U.S. ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, before he was the ambassador, had a regular column on Arad Sheva. Arad Sheva, Israel National News, is the mainstream settler media outlet. You see this sort of crossover over and over. The guy, what's his name in New York?
Which one?
Sorry, there's a number of people. I don't want to get the name wrong because they'll sue me. One of the main people who works with the far right-wing Southern groups, again, they place articles in the Southern media. So we have responsibility on both sides of the ocean for the shrinking space. It's useful, I think, to be aware of that. I'm going to close this now unless anyone has any last comments. I think this has been a very, very rich discussion. I appreciate it. I am so grateful for all the work that you guys do on the ground here and over there. We thank you for giving us some of your precious time today. I know a lot of us will have further questions and will want to be in touch, so I warn you, you will probably be hearing from people going forward. So thank you very much. And while I have you here, I also just want to mention we have another event. If you check the Foundation for Middle East Peace website, we have another event taking place in this room in a little over a week, featuring someone who's visiting from an organization called Grassroots Jerusalem. So look forward to that.